Why Spain sent its entire life savings to the Soviet Union. How Spain lost its gold to Stalin. On 14th September 1936, Madrid was still awake at 2 a.m., even with the lights turned low. People thought Spain was losing a war. They thought bullets and tanks decide history. They were wrong. Spain didn't lose the war that night. Spain lost the ledger, and the balance sheet followed it into darkness. We like to believe nations collapse with a flag falling and a last soldier crying in the street. But states don't die like heroes. They die like businesses. First comes a cash squeeze, then credit freezes, then bankruptcy arrives wearing a uniform. In that moment, Spain wasn't fighting only General Franco. Spain was fighting insolvency itself. The Republic's front line was not a trench. It was a vault door, a receipt, and a desperate signature. Think about what a government really is when the guns start firing. It's an employer with an empty payroll. It's an army with no fuel. It's a promise that needs collateral. When the collateral runs out, sovereignty becomes a story people tell themselves. Spain had one advantage left in 1936, and it wasn't courage. It was gold. Real gold. Heavy gold. The kind that doesn't negotiate. In the center of Madrid, the Bank of Spain stood like a fortress pretending to be a museum. The marble looked calm, but the country behind it was bleeding. Under that stone, deep in the belly of the city, lay a hoard built over centuries and guarded like a saint's bones. At its peak, Spain had worn empire like armor. Galleons, colonies, silver, parades, and cathedrals paid for by distant suffering. Even when the empire shrank, the myth stayed tall. Spain still had a treasury that made other nations stare. And the gold had a smell, if you stood close enough. Not perfume, not history. The smell of metal and power. The smell of a nation that could still buy time. The Republic told itself this hoard meant stability. It meant credibility in foreign markets. It meant the peseta could still speak in a world that only listened to bullion. It meant Spain could still breathe. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The country was split into factions that hated each other almost as much as they feared the enemy. The Republic had passion, speeches, flags, and volunteers. Franco had discipline, foreign backing, and a clear chain of command. Then came the real problem, the problem you can't shoot. The Republic needed weapons, and weapons demanded payment. International markets don't accept ideology as currency. They accept cash, gold, and reliable receipts. That's where the trap began to close. Britain and France preached non-intervention, a polite phrase meaning, "We will watch you drown." The United States stayed distant, counting its own wounds from the Depression. The arms market became a locked door with a single key. And that key was in Moscow. Debt is not a number. Debt is a living monster with a quiet voice. It offers help like a doctor offers morphine. It takes the edge off, it eases pain. Then you can't stop. The dose grows, and the bill arrives. Spain's fatal flaw wasn't bravery or strategy. It was an addiction to survival credit. Every week of war was a new invoice. Every rifle was a line item. Every plane was an installment plan written in steel and blood. The antagonist wasn't a general on horseback. It was a creditor with a calendar. It was the only supplier willing to sell, and the only supplier who could set the price. It was the Soviet state, operating like a pawnshop with an army. Stalin didn't need to invade Madrid to conquer Spain's economy. He only had to become the Republic's banker. Because once your enemy is outside your walls, and your creditor is inside your accounts, you've already been captured. Let that idea sink in. Sovereignty is solvency. When the money is gone, the flag is paper. When the ledger collapses, the Constitution becomes a poster. So the Republic made a decision that looks insane from a safe future. In September 1936, with Franco tightening the noose, Spanish officials authorized the transfer of their gold reserve to a safe place. The phrase sounded like protection. It was liquidation dressed as security. In practice, it meant trucks. Nights became the cover, because daylight brought bombers. Men went underground to the vaults with keys and combinations, not crowbars. The robbery wasn't performed by criminals. It was performed by clerks, guards, and bureaucrats moving like ghosts. Each crate was small enough to hug. Each crate was heavy enough to punish your spine. Roughly 65 kilograms per box, the kind of weight that turns hands into hooks. Wood creaked. Metal groaned. Sweat turned the air into steam. The gold moved in silence because silence is how you hide an amputation. The Republic was cutting off its own limb to stop the bleeding. It told itself it could sew it back later. Above ground, trucks waited with engines idling low. Drivers were given coordinates, not answers. They were told it was ammunition, because ammunition sounds patriotic. But gold has a specific density that truth can't disguise. When a truck squats under a load like a wounded animal, you don't need paperwork to know what's inside. Rumors spread because people always smell money when it moves at night. Still, the convoy rolled. The destination was Cartagena, a coastal port still loyal to the Republic. Around 450 kilometers from Madrid, but in 1936, it felt like another planet. Roads were broken, checkpoints unpredictable, and the sky belonged to whoever had the planes. The convoy drove like a thief, dark and careful, headlights off, roots hugging safety like a superstition. A single bomb could have turned Spain's fortune into glitter in a ditch. Along the way, villages slept hungry, families rationed bread and fear, and that is the cruel geometry of war finance. Wealth can pass starving mouths without feeding them. The ledger doesn't distribute mercy. When the gold reached Cartagena, it didn't become hope. It became cargo. It was stacked into coastal storage like ammunition, guarded like guilt. And then Spain waited for the next step, the one that turned safe place into foreign vault. That step arrived on Soviet ships. In late October 1936, freighters with ordinary names and ordinary paint anchored in the harbor. They looked like trade. They looked like routine. That was the point. The best thefts don't look like thefts. Loading began under darkness, stretched across nights that felt too long. Workers carried crates that lied about what they contained. The cover story was shells and bullets. The weight told the real story. This was not charity. This was collateral collection. It was a foreclosure in motion. If you want to understand how nations get stripped, don't watch parliaments. Watch docs. Watch manifests. Watch who controls the cranes, the perimeter, the paperwork. Watch who holds the receipt book. The Republic believed it was safeguarding the gold from Franco, but the ledger doesn't care about intentions. Once the gold leaves your soil, it stops being a reserve and becomes a bargaining chip in someone else's hand. The ships slipped away into the Mediterranean like shadows with a heartbeat. They moved east, avoiding interception, avoiding attention, avoiding history. In the holds sat Spain's financial spine, packed into wood and secrecy. The voyage wasn't just maritime risk, it was political risk. The Mediterranean in 1936 was a market of wolves, submarines, patrols, and neutral powers with sharp teeth. One boarding, one inspection, and the story ends differently. But the ships reached Odessa in early November 1936, and that was the true border crossing. The moment the gold touched Soviet docks, Spain's leverage evaporated. The Republic could still send telegrams. It could not send force. From Odessa, the gold traveled by armored train to Moscow. Train cars built to resist bullets, as if theft needed protection from thieves. Guards lined corridors. Workers were cleared away. Bureaucracy closed like a fist. In Moscow, the gold entered a system designed to absorb and erase. Counting began, weighing, logging, stamping. A performance of precision that looked like honesty. But precision can be a mask. Spain's representatives could observe. They could not touch. They could not argue. They stood behind barriers like visitors at their own funeral, watching others handle their inheritance. Every bar, every coin, every crate became a Soviet entry. Numbers in ledgers controlled by Soviet hands. And once the numbers belong to someone else, the truth follows them. Here is the economic trap, laid bare. Spain thought the gold was a deposit. Stalin treated it as a payment. Spain believed in safekeeping. Stalin believed in monetization. A deposit implies return. A payment implies completion. And now the Republic had only one supplier, only one creditor, only one pipeline for tanks, planes, rifles, and fuel. It had entered monopoly pricing in a war zone. This is where the rule of three begins its march. The gold was leaving. The credit was tightening. The Allies had turned away. That's not politics. That's insolvency. The smoking gun moment wasn't a battlefield victory. It was a document signed in fear. It was a decree that authorized movement to a safe place without naming Moscow. That vagueness was not style. It was the language of men who know they may be judged. In banking terms, it was liquidation. In street terms, it was pawning your house to buy bullets. Imagine the negotiation in plain words, stripped of diplomacy. Spain says, "We need weapons now." Moscow says, "Then pay now." Spain says, "We'll pay later when we survive." Moscow says, "Collateral first." That's the brutal reality of wartime finance. Creditors don't salute flags. They salute assets. And Stalin's system charged for everything: the equipment, the spare parts, the advisors, the transport. The Republic was billed like a drowning man billed for the rope. Even worse, pricing is power. When you are the only seller, you don't compete. You extract, you mark up, you decide which shipments arrive on time and which are delayed to increase pressure. The Republic kept fighting, but the balance sheet started to scream. War consumes cash the way fire consumes air. Tanks burn fuel. Artillery devours shells. Planes break, crash, disappear, and every replacement is another invoice. By 1937, the gold was not just held, it was being converted. Melted, sold, traded, shifted through markets. Not as Spanish treasure, but as anonymous metal. Laundered history. Let that number sink in again. Around 5 to 10 tons moved east in this operation, a mass so heavy it turns wealth into logistics. Wealth doesn't travel like paper, it travels like a machine. The climax of this story isn't a single explosion. It's the moment the account hits near zero, when telegrams asking for shipments get colder replies, when deliveries slow, when the creditor begins to ration your survival. By 1938, the Republic was running on fumes and faith. Ammunition became precious, repairs became improvised, morale became a currency spent too fast, and behind every shortage sat the same invisible cause, a ledger drained. People felt the collapse in simple ways: bread lines, cold apartments, worn boots. The humiliation of being a nation that once had reserves, now begging for credit like a broken shopkeeper. This is what default looks like. Not just financial default, political default. The loss of choices, the loss of dignity, the loss of time. Because sovereignty is solvency. When you can't pay, you can't decide. You can't choose allies. You can't set strategy. You can't even control your own internal politics, because your supplier can demand conditions. When the Republic fell in 1939, the war ended on paper. But the accounting didn't. The Soviet books could claim the gold was spent on supplies and services, and Spain, now under Franco, could rage about theft without leverage to reverse it. That's the perfect crime in financial history. The victim disappears, the perpetrator keeps the receipts, the market absorbs the asset, and time washes the fingerprints. In the years after, Spain carried the scar like a hidden bruise. The phrase "Moscow gold" became more than a story. It became a symbol of betrayal and a warning about what happens when a nation mortgages itself in panic. Generations grew up under the shadow of that decision, not because they could point to a single missing bar, but because they felt the aftermath in distrust, in politics, in the lingering sense that the country's wealth had once been packed into crates and never truly returned. And that is the bitter lesson accountants understand and generals often ignore. Wars are not won by speeches. Wars are sustained by reserves. When reserves leave, outcomes harden. The illusion is that history turns on ideology. The truth is uglier. History turns on cash flow. It turns on who can keep paying when everyone else runs out. It turns on who can buy steel, fuel, and bread one more month. So when you hear the title of this story, don't picture only Stalin in a distant office. Picture a stack of ledgers, Picture the balance sheet of a dying state. Picture a vault emptying while a city burns. Spain didn't just send gold to the Soviet Union. Spain sent time. Spain sent options. Spain sent its last bargaining chip into a system built to never give it back. If you want more stories like this, the kind where empires fall because the numbers turn against them, subscribe to the channel. Stay ahead of the people who only watch battles. Because the next collapse won't be announced by cannons. It will be announced by the ledger.